Lewis and Clark discover the Pacific. In 1803, the American president Thomas Jefferson bought almost a quarter of the United States from France. The United States is a very big country with many tall mountains and big rivers, but not many people were living in the country in the 19th century, and no one had found a trail to the Pacific Ocean. President Jefferson asked two men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to travel on the Missouri River and other rivers because he wanted to find a trail to the Pacific Ocean. Lewis and Clark discovered the Pacific Ocean after many dangerous and difficult months of travel. May 14, 1804. They said goodbye to Camp Dubois, Illinois at 4 p.m. and departed on the Missouri River in 3 sailboats. The biggest of the 3 sailboats was called a keelboat. It was 55 feet long and 8 feet wide, and it carried all of their food, medicine, guns, and cannons. Commanders Lewis and Clark were in the big keelboat, and the other men were in 2 smaller rowboats. It was windy, and they sailed many miles before camping. Lewis and Clark believed they would find the Pacific Ocean by sailing north and west on the Missouri River. October 24, 1804. They traveled for many months and arrived at a wide place on the Missouri River, where they built their camp. Some of the men explored the forests and discovered more than 4,500 Mandan and Hidatsa people living in big houses that looked like hills. Lewis and Clark wanted to live near the Mandan and Hidatsa for the winter, and they designed and built a fort near the river and called it Fort Mandan. November 4th, 1804. Many of the people who lived in the forests and the mountains visited Fort Mandan. They needed food, so they agreed to help Lewis and Clark. On November 4th, they met a white man named Toussaint Charbonneau. He had been living with the Hidatsa for more than 10 years, but he didn't speak the Hidatsa language very well. He was married to 2 women. One of his wives was a Shoshone woman named Sakakawea, who understood how to make medicine using plants and trees. More important for Lewis and Clark, Sakakawea spoke many different languages. If someone who spoke Shoshone or other American Indian languages wanted to speak to Lewis and Clark, they first spoke to Sakakawea in their language. Then she spoke to Toussaint in Hidatsa. Then he spoke in French to one of their men, who then spoke in English to Lewis and Clark. Sometimes it was difficult for them to understand each other. February 11th, 1805. A baby named Jean-Baptiste was born to Sakakawea at the fort. In spring, Lewis and Clark would leave the fort and sail west. And although Sakakawea was now a mother, she would go with them to the Pacific Ocean. Jean-Baptiste would soon be the youngest person to explore America. September 11th, 1805. They left boats in the river and they hiked west over the Bitterroot Mountains. But because many of the men were sick and there was a lot of snow on the trail, they soon were lost. It was cold and dark in the woods, and their hands and feet were almost frozen. They didn't catch any birds or animals, and the men almost died. September 22nd, 1805. They finally found a trail out of the forest. They met Chief Twisted Hair of the Nez Perce, and he asked Lewis and Clark to visit his home. But Lewis and many of the men were still sick, and Clark had to go alone. There were more than 100 Nez Perce living on an island named Fishing Island because of the many fish in the Clearwater River. The Nez Perce were very interesting people. The men and the women had very long black hair worn in braids, and they lived in tents called teepees. Chief Twisted Hair taught Clark how to use pine trees to build small boats. He also drew Clark a map of the rivers, which showed them that they were not far from the Pacific Ocean. The Nez Perce brought fresh fish to Lewis and the other men, but some of them got sick from eating too much. November 7th, 1805. Lewis and Clark hiked the last miles to the Pacific Ocean with 10 of the men. But before arriving at the Pacific Ocean, they met people who were living in houses on a small island in the Columbia River. The women were wearing skirts made from the bark of trees, and the men sold Lewis and Clark fish, plants, and dogs. In the evening, Lewis and Clark stood on a hill to see the ocean. They had traveled more than 4,000 miles, and they had finally found the Pacific Ocean. In March of 1806, Lewis and Clark and the others began the long walk home. Before leaving the Pacific Ocean, they voted on where to camp for the winter. When he was 6 years old, Sakakuya's son, Jean-Baptiste, lived with William Clark in St. Louis, Missouri. When he was 18 years old, he traveled in Europe for 6 years learning how to speak German. He returned to the United States in 1829 and worked as a guide. Like his mother, he spoke many languages: Spanish, English, Hidatsa, German, and French.